All right, so good morning, everyone, and welcome again to our webinar this morning in our Meet the Author series with Dr. William Stixrud. My name is Mary Beth Harrison Cunningham, and I'm the manager here at the Family Resource Center, and we were very, very excited to have all of you here with us this morning. So I did want to welcome Dr. Stixrud and let you all know a little bit more about him. So Dr. Stixrud, PhD, is a clinical neuropsychologist and founder of the Stixrud Group, as well as a faculty member at Children's National Medical Center and an assistant professor of psychiatry and pediatrics at the George Washington University School of Medicine. He is also the co-author with Ned Johnson of the national best-selling book, The Self-Driven Child, which is published in 18 countries and 17 languages and has sold more than 1 million copies in China alone. He and Mr. Johnson have also co-authored a critically acclaimed second book, What Do You Say? Talking with Kids to Build Motivation, Stress Tolerance, and a Happy Home. Dr. Stixrud's work has been featured in media outlets such as NPR, CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Times of London, the Wall Street Journal, U.S. News and World Report, Time Magazine, Scientific American, Business Week, Barron's, New York Magazine, and Vogue. He is a longtime practitioner of transcendental meditation, and he plays in the rock band Close Enough. All right, Dr. Stixrud, thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Thank you, Mary. Pleasure to be here. So thanks, folks, for joining me and joining us here. So I'm a clinical neuropsychologist, and I test kids for a living. I test kids if they're having problems of any kind. I try to figure out what's wrong, what's right, and how to help them. And I've done it long enough that I have experiences like right before the pandemic, I tested this kid with autism who has a savant ability that if you tell him your birth date, he can tell you what day of the week you're born. And so I get to the office one day, and two younger psychology associates are there, and they try it out, and he nails it. They look on the internet, he nails it. Said, Bill, you got to do it. So the kid says, when's your birth date? I said, November 11th, 1949. And he thought for a minute or so. Then he thought, 1940s, I can't go back that far. And so it's a little humbling. A few years ago, my granddaughter said, when she was 5, she said, Grandpa, how old are you? I said, 65. She said, starting from 1? So in any case, I'm experienced. So let me tell you, I'll show the first slide here. And my co-author, Ned Johnson, and I have been working together for about 10 years. And the main concerns that we have are that so many kids, especially including kids in really high-achieving schools, affluent families, are just too tired and too stressed for too long, which is really how you become depressed. And also, we know that if a kid develops an anxiety disorder or depression during childhood or adolescence, it doesn't doom them, but it does increase the risk that they'll have mental health problems in adulthood as well. And our goal, some of the kids that we work with, and many of the families we work with, seem to have the idea that the most important outcome of a child's childhood and adolescent is where they go to college. And our angle is we want kids to have a skill to take with them into adulthood a healthy brain, and a brain that's not used to be chronically tired and exhausted and stressed. And we want kids to develop ways of working themselves and becoming successful that are sustainable and that allow them to enjoy their success. And my main mission is to help parents feel that it's safe. Take a step back, trust their kids a bit, kind of lower the temperature. And as one parent in this very high achieving suburb of Chicago said, help us get off the crazy train of just constant worry and pressure. So that's kind of where we are. And our major thesis is that one of the most important things we can do for our kids, besides loving them unconditionally, is to help them develop a healthy sense of control of their own lives. And Ned and I got to this sense of control as our major focus. Give me 1 second. Something on my screen is supposed to save. As our main focus for 2 reasons. One is that all the stress-related mental health problems, whether it's anxiety disorders, depression, chemical use, self-harm, they're all related to very highly related to a low sense of control. And you think about it, and if you're anxious, your thinking's out of control. You'd like to stop worrying, but you can't. And if you're depressed, forget it. You have very little sense of control. If you're chemically dependent, your life is completely chaotic. And also, every place we look to understand how do kids develop that healthy self-drive, that ability, that desire to motivate themselves, so they have something useful to offer this world. Every arrow, all the arrows point in the direction of autonomy or a sense of control. And unfortunately, kids' sense of control gets lower every year, and it's gotten lower generationally since the 1960s, particularly in the last 10 years. So we figure a sense of control is a really big deal. And because it's such a big deal, and because it's getting lower, we need that focusing on it really makes sense. Now, my screen is not advancing here for some reason. Let me see. Let me see if I'm mouse will do it. Well, doesn't seem to be advancing.
Okay.
Well, let's see. Let me try. Well, I'm not the most technologically sophisticated person. I'll tell you what. I will. Let's see. How do I?
There you go. Oops.
Oh,
Got it.
Did I do it?
Yes,
okay.
Sir.
Whoa. Blind luck. So let me tell you what a sense of control is and what it isn't. So Ned and I think about it, a sense of control in two dimensions. One is the subjective sense of autonomy. This is my life, otherwise known as an internal locus of control. I'm not, and also it's the confidence that we can handle and manage stressful situations. And it also, the second dimension is the brain dimension, which is when you have a healthy sense of control, your prefrontal cortex, the most recently evolved part of your brain, is regulating the rest of the brain. And whenever your prefrontal cortex activates, it dampens down your stress response. So if something stressful happens, your prefrontal cortex activates, you go into coping mode. And that's where we want to be most of the time, is with our prefrontal cortex kind of running through the rest of the brain. And so what it isn't, a low sense of control involves feeling helpless or hopeless, passive, stuck, resigned, and feeling, or just feeling really anxious and overwhelmed. A lot of kids I see are obsessively driven or depressed. And it turns out that a sense of control is good for everything. You live longer, you have better relationships, you have more career success, more academic success. It's good for everything. And just this brain piece. This is a slice of the brain looking from the inside. So the red is actually the white matter that connects the prefrontal cortex, the green part here, the top green, from the two lower parts of the amygdala. And it's that strength of the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala that's really one of the best predictors of best signs of mental health. That we want kids to develop really strong connections between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. And we know that among the things that weaken the connections are getting not getting enough sleep and being too tired. So it's a big deal. And the sense of control I will mention, when we started to write about it, that every place we looked, it came up. I remember reading this article in the Atlantic about the spate of suicides that occurred kind of in the mid 2015 or 16 in Palo Alto. And two psychologists were asked about it. And one said, these kids feel existentially impotent. And another one said, I used to do I've done psychotherapy with these kids for 25 years. And 15 years ago, they used to fight back. I'm not going to live like this. I can't stand it. And now they're just resigned to it. It's that resignation, that feeling of helplessness or hopelessness, or there's nothing I can do about it. And it's such a powerful construct that, as Mary mentioned, that our book is really popular in China and in various parts of Asia. And we've done workshops in India and in Pakistan, all over the world, young people are experiencing a lot of these mental health crises. And people are seeing that this sense of control is such a powerful way to think about how to help them. So so how did we get to a sense of control? Well, the first thing is we know, as I said, that all the mental health issues, they're all stress-related disorders. They all involve a dysregulated stress response. And also, I went to this seminar in 2008 by this neuroscientist who said, I defy you to think of anything that makes life stressful that doesn't involve the nuts. The idea of stress makes you nuts. So it's novelty, unpredictability, threat to the body or ego, and a low sense of control. And all the stress scientists say is that low sense of control that's the most stressful thing you can experience. Because I mean, if you think about it, if you're in a stressful situation and you've been here before, I can manage it. I know how to do this. It's not that stressful. But if your kid is sick or something happening at work and you don't know what to do, the doctors don't know what to do, there's nothing more stressful than that helpless, low sense of control feeling. And living in Northern Virginia, you made this may make sense to you, but the traffic jams are so stressful because what can you do about it? You're stuck. There's nothing you can do. It's that low sense of control that makes them so stressful. Now, we also got to sense of control through the work of a guy named Steve Mayer, who's professor emeritus now at the University of Colorado. And Mayer, he concludes from his research with rats. And rats have brains that are organized a lot like ours, so there's a lot that we can actually learn from these studies. He says the perception of control inoculates you from the harmful effects of stress. And the paradigm of his studies, he's got rat A and rat B, and they're in plexiglass cages, and there's their tail are outside the cages with a little electrode on it. There's a wheel in the cage, and what happens is the tails get shocked. Rat A, tail gets shocked, discovers if he turns the wheel that the shock stops. And what happens is rat A has several experiences where he turns the wheel and the shock stops. He can control a stressful situation. And when he's turning the wheel, as I said, the prefrontal cortex activates and it dampens down the stress response. So he's not very stressed. He's just turning that wheel he's coping with, even though it's unpleasant. And the rat B gets shocked, turns the wheel, and nothing happens. His shock only stops when rat A turns the wheel. So rat A, after several experiences like this, becomes almost impossible to stress because he develops that confidence, that perception of control, or that confidence that he can handle stressful situations. Rat B becomes a nervous wreck, develops tumors and all kinds of anxiety problems, very easily stressed because he didn't learn that sense of control. And interestingly, some of you may know this construct of learned helplessness, which Steve Mayer and Martin Seligman wrote about 50 years ago. Very recently, they said the dogs who got shocked and couldn't escape from their cage, they didn't learn helplessness. They failed to learn a sense of control. So that's how we got there. And as I said, every place we look now, we're seeing how important the sense of control is. There's been a few studies recently that have shown that the kind of the active ingredient of cognitive behavioral therapy, the reason it helps kids with anxiety and depression, is that increases their sense of control. You know, the kids they learn to take control of their thinking. They learn strategies for regulating their stress response, and they're trained in active coping skills. So it increases that sense of control. And also, a recent study on exercise concluded that the reason that people who exercised during the pandemic, they felt better, was to increase their sense of control. Same thing, meditation increases the sense of control, as does a good night's sleep, as does exercise. Things that are good for the brain that allow that prefrontal cortex to better regulate the rest of the brain. Now, I'll just mention that just in terms of the relationship to learning, that so many kids that I work with, and I mean, so many kids in Fairfax County, they're up till 12 or midnight, and they find school highly stressful. And we've known for 40 years that the optimal internal state for learning is relaxed alertness, which you experience when you have a sense of control. And the optimal learning environment is high challenge, so you aren't bored, you're stimulated, but low threat, because we know that threat takes the prefrontal cortex offline and makes it very hard to learn, hard to pay attention like that. So we know in the self-driven child, we have a drawing of this, what's called the Yerkes-Dodson curve, which basically has this idea there's an optimal level of arousal or kind of stress hormones for you to function at your peak. And it's higher if you're performing as a musician or you're gearing up for a competition or taking a test than it is if you're just reading a book. But if it's too low, if you're too tired, or you're too stressed, that it's very hard to focus, very hard to learn. So this idea of strengthening the sense of control to keep the prefrontal cortex online is really important. And thinking about a sense of control in these two dimensions, the subjective dimension and the brain dimension, gives us two different ways to help kids. One is by giving them more sense of autonomy. This is my life, not so they don't feel forced or they don't feel controlled all the time. And secondly, is doing what we can to promote the brain state that allows that. Now, we talk in both our books about motivation, and basically my thinking about motivation is grounded in these basic what I call postulates. You know, that you can't make somebody do something against their will. And when I used to do therapy with kids, I'd see parents who, you know, their kids who in a very blue state in Maryland, if their kids were interested in guns, were very worried about their big mass killers, you know, and they wanted me to talk the kids out of it. And I can't, you can't talk a kid out of wanting what they want, and you can't make them not want what they don't want. And also, if we try to change people, people often ask me, how do I motivate my kid? And what we're really asking is, how do I change my kid? And we know from lots of research that if you try to change somebody who's not asking you to help them change, all you get is conflict and resistance. So those are some of that kind of grounds my thinking of motivation. And my North Star in terms of thinking about how to motivate students in a healthy way is what's called self-determination theory, that holds that we have these three basic needs that have to be met in order for kids to have that intrinsic motivation, to have that internal self-drive. And one's for a sense of relatedness. You work harder for a teacher you feel respects you, you feel connected to. You're more likely to want to motivated to please your parents if you have a good relationship with them. Because it's a competence. You don't feel like working very hard is something you feel you suck at. And also autonomy. And the people who made up self-determination 30 years ago, they say that autonomy is the key. And most of the research on this has been on promoting autonomy in kids and giving them choices. Do you want to do it this way or this way? It's hugely successful in school for kids learning, for teachers to having more autonomy, huge. So self-determination theory is kind of where we start. But every place else we looked, as I said earlier, what we get to is a sense of control. I'm sure many of you know about Carol Dweck's work on the growth mindset versus a growth mindset is I get better through my own efforts. And a fixed mindset is, well, I'm born with a certain amount of ability, not much I can do about it. So don't give me anything hard. I don't want to look stupid. And a growth mindset is really a sense of control. I get better through my own efforts. I'm not helpless. And also, for years, I read this guy, I've been reading about this guy named Reed Larson, who studies adolescent development. And he's concluded that the way children turn into self-motivated adolescents and adults, it's not through dutifully doing their homework. It's not through jumping all the hoops through all the hoops you're expected to jump through. It's for what he called the passionate pursuit of pastimes. And what he said is that if a 3-year-old is building with Legos and really involved in it, and something goes wrong and he has to fix it, that deep engagement in something that's important to you or that you love doing, that flow experience of being completely involved, completely engaged, is hugely good for the brain. He said that's what creates a brain that knows how to go pedal to the metal about things that are important. And when I read about this, the first thing I thought about was that I graduated from high school with a 2.8 grade point average. Well, I round up as 2.7 something, but I just school wasn't my priority. I was into sports and particularly into rock and roll, particularly my last 2 years into rock and roll. And I was in a band, and I really lived for the band. And every night I tell myself that, okay, I'll go and practice my instrument, or I'll learn a song, or sing something for an hour, and then I'll do homework. And I'd come out of this little room where I had an organ and a record player, like 2.5 hours later, 3 hours later. I had no idea what time it was, being so deeply absorbed in what I was doing. It's something I was really passionate about. And my father died in my senior year of high school, and we're at the very end. And I started college 2.5 months later as a straight A student. And it's not like I got smarter. I think my father's dying kind of woke me up a bit and made me think school's more important. But what I realized over time is that experience of having lots of experience, being deeply engaged in something that was important to me. And fortunately, I sculpted a brain that once school became important to me, I could go pedal to the metal. And I was fortunate not to have parents who say, why are you wasting time playing rock and roll? You should be studying. They knew I was reasonably bright. They had confidence I'd figure things out. And took some time, but I did. So that's the motivation piece, that this autonomy or sense of control is huge for motivation. Now, one of the ideas that I'd say certainly one of the key ideas, and I want to give you some of the key ideas and the main take-home points from the self-driven child in this presentation, is that, well, I'll tell you this way. In 1986, I wrote a paper. What I noticed when I went through my work, because I used to do therapy and test kids for about 10 or 15 years. Then I stopped doing therapy and just test. But in any case, early in my career, I was struck by how many parents said, I hate dinner time, because after dinner is 3 hours of World War III trying to fight with my kid about his homework. Or kids, and I talked to underachievers, and I'd say, if you don't turn in an assignment, who's most upset? And invariably they'd say my mom. And then I used this family therapy technique and said, who's next most upset? And they'd say my dad, then my teacher, then my tutor, then my therapist. And the kid was never on the list. And I realized I'd sit down and do psychotherapy with a 35-year-old. And I'd say, how can I help? And they'd say, I feel like I've spent the last 35 years of my life trying to live up to other people's expectations. Now I'm trying to figure out what's important to me. And I figured, let's get an early start on this. So in any case, I wrote this article in McLean's magazine, McCall's magazine, I guess it was, just on how not to fight with kids about homework. And what it suggested was that you tell your kid, I love you too much to fight with you about your homework. And then you say, I'm willing to do anything I can to help you. I'm willing to structure your homework time. I'm willing to sit with you from 6:30 to 7:30 if you need my help. I'm willing to get a tutor if you need it. But I just love you too much to fight with you about this every night. Make this a big hassle. I care more about you than I do about your homework. And so one of the implications here is that as a parent, as consultant, is that we offer help and offer advice, but we don't try to force it. I see a lot of kids who need therapy. I see a lot of kids who have learning disabilities, who need tutoring. And in less extreme cases, like kids who are in terrible denial, I don't believe in trying to make them do therapy or make them do tutoring or language therapy, whatever, if they don't want it, they don't feel they need it. because having kids use their energy resisting things that are probably in their own best interest isn't a great way for them to use their energy. And I'll just mention, I have on the slide here, I love you too much to fight about your homework. And one of my clients, shortly after our book came out, emailed me and said, I just told my 8th grade son, I love you too much to fight with you about your homework. And then she said, first he smiled, then he hugged me, and then he said, is something wrong with you, Mom? So that's one implication is we offer help and advice and we don't try to force it. And a second is that ideally, I remember 30 some years ago, one of my childhood friends who's also a neuropsychologist did training in a certain kind of psychotherapy. And the therapists were told, don't work harder to help your clients solve their problems than they do, because you're going to weaken them, because they're going to think that somebody other than them is responsible for solving their problems. Or the solution lies within you, not within them. And I use this. I had a tutor training program for about 25 years. And I always taught the tutors who worked with kids with learning disabilities or ADHD. I said, if you're trying to help a kid get better in reading, and it feels to you like you're working harder than he does, say, honey, I love you too much to work harder than you do, because I'm going to weaken you that way. Because I'm going to make you think that somehow I could make you learn, or I'm responsible for it. And I want to do anything I can to help you, but I don't want to work harder than you do. Also, several years ago, I did this program with a parent educator, and we made up these scenarios. And we had, a 3rd grader comes home, and she's the only kid in her friend group who didn't get invited to a birthday party. Or a 15-year-old comes home, and he got cut from the basketball team, or his girlfriend dumped him, and he's really upset. And the first question we asked parents to ask themselves before they responded was, whose problem is it? And it's not like, it's your problem, buddy. It's not like that, but it's respectful, because we want kids to have the experience of being able to solve their own problems. Because as I said earlier, that's what creates that sense of control. That's what creates that confidence that I can handle stressful situations, is by doing it. The people who can handle stressful situations, they do it because they've been there before, in something similar, and their brain knows how to go into coping mode. We want kids to be sculpting coping brains, as opposed to brains that avoid stressful situations or freak out when stress gets high. So we want as much as possible. We want kids to solve their own problems. That doesn't mean that we don't help. We aren't there to support, but we're wired. It's hard because we're mammals. We're wired to protect our young and to soothe them. So our first instinct when they're unhappy is to try to make it better. And ultimately, what we want to do, in my opinion, is we want to express confidence. I'm 100% confident that you can handle this. You can figure this out. I will help you in any way I can, but I know you can do it. So that's what develops that kind of self-confidence. And I'll mention that I was lecturing about the self-driven child in Houston before the pandemic. And I happened to mention, arguably the most elite independent school in this whole area. And I don't remember why I did, but I did. And this woman came up to me after my lecture, and she said, I'm a therapist here at the Menninger Clinic, this excellent mental health clinic in Houston. And she said, we know this independent school in DC really well, because so many of the graduates get into the top colleges in the country, but they can't handle it emotionally. So as soon as they get a B, or when they realize that everybody here is as smart as I am, or something goes wrong with it, they ask a girl out a date, she doesn't want to go with them, they crumble like a porcelain teacup, and they come here for therapy. So we want kids to have a sense that this is their life. And part of the rationale for this idea of thinking about ourselves as the kids get older, more as consultants to our kids, whose goal it is to help them figure out who they want to be and how to create a life that they want, rather than their boss or the manager or their homework police. The part of the rationale for this idea of parent as consultant is that we want kids to be able to run their own lives successfully before they leave home. And so many kids, so many kids that I work with, they go to college and they're home by November. They just simply had enough. They have not had enough experience. And that's what this woman does at manager clinic said. They don't have enough experience solving their own problems, making their own decisions. They've jumped through hoops for so many years. They don't know quite who they are and how to handle their life. And so this idea, we shift our thinking from knowing, I always know what's best for my kid, and I'll guide him. You need to do this, you need to do that. And certainly we need to set limits. We're wise. We can impart our wisdom, our suggestions to kids, but as much as possible, remember that we want them to learn to run their own life. You don't want to send a kid off to college or to the workplace who doesn't know how to get out of bed in the morning, who can't manage his own use of technology, who doesn't know how to make an appointment with somebody if they need help or something. So that's the idea. This is my favorite slide of family who's not actually playing this consultant role. We've been thinking a lot about what we want to do with your life. And it feels like that to a lot of kids. Now, I'll just mention in our new book, or our second book called What Do You Say? We talk about the language of a parent consultant. And so this includes the language of getting buy-in. So rather than just, so many parents say, God, I've told them a million times, I keep trying to get him to see, that we suggest saying instead is saying, I've got an idea, can I run it by you? Or can I make a suggestion? Or is there a way I could help? I wonder what would happen if you tried this. And one of the things I say a lot with kids, where I don't want them to feel like I'm trying to force, is as I say, for whatever it's worth, and I think that it's very powerful. This I was giving a lecture before the pandemic in upper state New York, and I happened to mention this idea of, is there a way I could help? And this mother who's sitting in the front row, she turns around and tells the rest of the audience, this idea has transformed my relationship with my 15-year-old daughter. She's in a boarding school, and every week we talk on the phone a couple of times, and she brings up a problem, and I say, well, you need to do this or this or this, and then she fights me on it, and it just devolves into an argument. And said, last week she called and told me some problem, and I just said, is there a way that I could help? And then it was fun. Then we brainstormed back and forth, and it wasn't me trying to lay stuff on her. And the second aspect of the language of a parent consultant is what we call the language of no force. And even with the most difficult, resistant, oppositional kids, the best wisdom is you can't make them do stuff. So you tell them, I'm not going to try to use the force of my will to make you do things. When my kids were little, if they'd fight me on something, I'd say, you're acting like I think I could make you do it. I couldn't make you do it. All you have to do is flop on the floor or close your eyes or start screaming. I couldn't make you do this. And then I try to work out as a relationship. If you fight me on this, it makes me less motivated to do this for you. Let's figure something out that works for both of us. So this idea of getting buy-in, it's really powerful, as opposed to just blathering on or telling kids a million times. Talking about stressful things, seeing nature is soothing for the human brain. So one other aspect of this idea of parent as consultant is that we want kids as much as possible to make their own decisions. And the premise is that that kids want their lives to work out. I don't meet a kid who's intentionally trying to self-destruct. I see kids who act self-destructively, but they don't want, they still, at deep level, they want their lives to work out. And with help, with support, with brainstorming about the pros and cons, kids can make as good of them decisions for themselves as I can make for them. And also, we don't always know what's best for kids. You know, I flunked out of graduate school the first time I went. I was in a doctoral program in English literature, and I went 20 straight weeks without turning any assignments in. So I flunked out. And when I work with underachievers, I said, 20 weeks turned in nothing. Top that. But I felt like my whole life had gone up in smoke. I had this fantasy about being a 26-year-old English professor, and I felt like my whole life had gone up in smoke. It took me about 6 weeks, maybe a month, to realize it was the best possible thing that could have happened to me. Always felt like an imposter. I felt kind of out of my league. I'm not really a literary type. And so I started working with children, and I was a terrible teacher. I kind of failed my way into being a decent psychologist. But my point is that it felt like often what feels like a disaster, it can lead to something better. So we don't always know best what's right for our kids. And as I said, it's hard to judge. Do you judge whether the decision is good or bad the next day, or a month later, or 5 years later, or 10 years later? And also, kids need a lot of practice making informed decisions, because the way you become a good decision maker is you practice. And so what I encourage parents to do, kids have an important decision to make, is to sit with them and draw out the pros and cons and say, I want this to be your call. And I'll tell you, I felt my whole career, the best message you can give an adolescent, besides I love you unconditionally, is that I have confidence in your ability to make decisions about your own life and to learn from your mistakes. And I want you to have a ton of experience doing that before you leave home. So that's the idea. And in my experiences, as I said, if I sit down and I say, I want this to be your call, let's think through the pros and cons. Kids can, because decisions are rooted in part in emotions. We want kids to tune into their own emotions and think about, what do I really want? What's important to me? Or how might this affect my family or my friends if I make this decision? So we want them to practice to become good decision makers. And so that's my motto, is to go with the kid's decision unless it's crazy. Meaning, unless almost any reasonable person would say, God, that's a terrible idea. And if you disagree, just engage in a kind of problem solving about, and if kid has a crazy decision, then you say, that's not going to work. That's not working for me. But most kids, when they're trusted to make decisions and it's supported, they don't make crazy decisions. Now, another idea that comes up in both of our books is this idea of a non-anxious presence. And I didn't get this idea. I didn't make up this term, but I wish I did. It's just a guy named Edwin Friedman made it up. And he was a family therapist and a rabbi, and he worked with families and organizations. He worked with families and churches and synagogues and corporations. And he concluded that virtually any system works best if the people in charge can serve as a non-anxious presence, meaning they're not highly emotionally reactive, they're not overly burdened by anxiety or fear, and they communicate courage rather than fear. And when we wrote our second book, we were trying to think, what must kids be thinking to contribute to this epidemic of mental health problems? And it seemed to me they must think that the message they're getting is to be very afraid. And we know that stress is contagious. All emotions are contagious. I mean, if you're a mother holding a newborn, and or say an infant, and you're asked to do something stressful, your stress hormones go up, and so do the baby's. That if you're a kid in a classroom with a burned out teacher, you have higher levels of stress hormone than kids who are with teachers who enjoy their job. And so the idea is, when we're calm, if we can be a non-anxious presence for our kids, we can be a more empathic. It's easier to support autonomy and to allow them to take healthy risks. We also are more encouraging of them. And we know from a variety of angles that when we focus on reducing our own anxiety, on our own fearfulness, that it helps our kids. And I remember working very early in my career with this family whose kid was in the 8th grade, and he had polio as a kid, and he had a leg brace. And he was just this resilient kid, and it didn't bother him much. He played little league, he did all this stuff. But in 8th grade, he couldn't play baseball anymore. And girls weren't that interested in him. And he got depressed. And his dad started crying and saying, this should be the happiest time of his life. And I said, well, obviously you skipped 8th grade. But then he said, we just want him to feel good about himself. And I said, respectfully, I think we can help him feel good about himself. We'll be better able to help him feel better about himself if we aren't worried sick. So how do we heal our own worry, our own fear? Because ideally, we communicate courage. I can handle it, you can handle it, rather than fear. And ideally, home is a safe base where work and school is stressful enough that to come home and so many of the kids, particularly that my co-author Ned, who runs Prep Matters, he's a test prep guru. So many of the really anxious, driven kids he works with, if they get a B on something, they say, "Don't tell my parents; they'll kill me." They're afraid to go home to their parents, who ideally are the most supportive people in their lives. So working on this idea, simply having the goal of being a non-anxious presence for your family, not overly reactive, not overly fearful, and communicating that confidence rather than fear. And there's some of the ways that we suggest to parents that you can move in this direction. First is take a long view. I mean, I got this Christmas card a couple of years ago, and on the front of it, there was these 3 young adults with their spouses all dressed up, and the parents had written, "You were right." And I flipped the card over, and then it says, "They all turned out great." Now, these are 3 kids that I had tested and followed for many years, starting from like the mid 1990s, probably into about 2010. Hadn't seen any of them for 10 years, at least. And but the parents said that they figured it out. And you told us that as their brains matured, they'll figure it out, and they did. And so most kids turn out fine. And I think that all of our anxiety about our kids, it's about the future. It's about that somehow they're going to get stuck in some negative place. If they're in a negative place now, they're going to get stuck and they won't get better. And again, we don't know what to do. We have this hopeless feeling. But if we can remember that the brain, the prefrontal cortex is not mature. The cognitive function is not mature until 25 plus minus 3, and the emotional regulation functions not mature until 32 plus minus 3. So we got a long time. And also, there's so many influences on kids' life besides us who can make things better. When I used to do therapy, I was struck by how often I'd sit with a family who'd bring up a problem, and I'm inside thinking, I don't know what to do either. And they'd come back a week later or 2 weeks later, and the problem was solved in some completely unanticipated way. So also, we recommend the parents set their highest parenting goal as simply enjoying your kid. Because when you enjoy your kid, he experiences himself or she experiences herself as a joy-producing organism, as opposed to a frustration or anxiety or anger-producing organism. And just what we do is say, focus on make that a priority, just to enjoy your kid, and then work backwards. What's keeping them, and address that. And we're huge fans of stress management routines for parents. As Mary mentioned, I've been practicing transcendental meditation now for 50 years. And I know about this kid who he learned transcendental meditation. He has autism. He learned transcendental meditation when he was 17 with his mother. And the mother is very well connected in New York and had somebody from the New York Times come to write an article about these two meditating together. And the kid was asked, "What do you notice from the meditation?" And he said, "It calms the mind and it calms the mom." She was able to be a more non-anxious presence. And whether it's meditation or yoga or exercise or whatever, but just helping us move in this direction where we're throwing off stress. So as my co-author Ned says, if the inflows of stress aren't balanced by the outflows of stress, stress builds up and bad things happen. So just practicing stress management. And we talk in both our books about this idea of radical acceptance, which is rather than thinking if a kid's in a hard place right now, this is a big disaster, because we don't really know. It's not like we've seen a plan for the kid's life. For all I know, this is exactly what's supposed to be happening. And so this idea is opposed to thinking as disaster, thinking this must be part of his path. And it's hard. And I want to do everything I can to help him. But this is, if I can accept this right now as part of the path that he or she has to go through. And we also know that simply increasing the number of positive words you use with kids lowers anxiety levels. So stuff like that. But that's the basic idea, is that I would say the majority of kids now that I work with, who I test, have anxiety disorders. And I will say that it's rarely intuitive to a parent that one of the best ways to help kids with their anxiety is to work on our own. Now, we also have this idea of radical downtime. And it struck me some years ago that the pace of life has increased so dramatically. And the amount we sleep has decreased so dramatically since the advent of the electric light, even the last 20, 30 years, decreased significantly. And that we need more radical downtime. And I mentioned here in this slide the default mode network, which is the part of the brain. It's a network in the brain that only activates when you aren't doing a task. So if you're just sitting in a waiting room and you aren't reading and you aren't looking at your phone, it's your default mode that activates. And there's been concern that kids don't have enough time where they're just in their own heads like that for the default mode to activate, because we know that one of the keys to mental health is very efficiently toggling between a focus on a task and then back in your own head, focus on a task and back in your own head. And so we want kids to have experience, to have more radical downtime. And the reason it was radical is that 20 years ago, you could say, my downtime is gardening. Or my downtime is I walk the dog. And we're suggesting now we need more radical downtime that includes daydreaming or mind wandering, which are hugely important for creativity and problem solving. And for young people, having time to be in their own head is crucial for empathy and creating a coherent sense of identity. If the empathy piece, if I say something mean to my sister or my friend, and I see the way she reacts, I have to reflect on it to really incorporate. I don't want to do that again. And creating a coherent identity, you have to think about yourself. You have to reflect on your past and your future. Who do I want to be? How did that work out for me? So kids need time. And so many kids these days, they're so highly scheduled, they have very little time to be in their own heads. And we know that this default mode network in the brain uses 80% of the brain's energy. So it's a big deal. Also, as I mentioned, the other form of radical downtime is meditation. And we support both transcendental and mindfulness practices. And sleep. We call sleep the most radical downtime. And some of the kids I work with, this is really like their story. And I won't spend much time on this, but we as you know, that you feel a lot better, and you do a lot better, and you focus a lot better when you are well rested. And if kids slept, there's a woman at Yale who teaches, Laurie Santos, who teaches a course on the science of happiness, which is the most popular course in the history of Yale University. I'll talk about that in a minute. And but in any case, she says that the kids that she works with in very high achieving schools, public and private, the high school kids, they sleep 4 to 6 hours a night. Same at Yale. And Santos was struck by the fact, she's a psychology professor who lived in residential dormitories with students at Yale. And she was struck by the fact that these kids got into the best college in the country, arguably, and certainly one of the most prestigious in the world, and they were miserable. They're so tired, they're so stressed, they're so competitive with each other. They didn't enjoy anything about being at Yale. That didn't do it. And so the idea is she started teaching this course on the science of happiness. What do we actually know about what makes people happy? And achievement is part of it, but it's a small percentage of what contributes to really being happy. And our concern is that we focus so much on achievement. And kids get to it, they achieve, but it doesn't make them happy. So we want to balance. Achievement's not trivial, it's important. We want kids to develop themselves and to work hard. We want them to do it in a way that also have adequate downtime so they aren't chronically tired and chronically stressed. And just I have some suggestions here for schools for sleep. I'm just my time's going to a short here, drawing to an end here. So I'm going to skip this and just say a couple things about sleep and technology. Well, actually, I'll do this. Think about yourself as a mentor to your kid regarding sleep, where the goal is to help kids find out the best way, the best time for them to go to sleep, how much sleep they need, what are the best conditions for helping them get ready for bed, so that you become a kind of sleep consultant. In the same way, in both our books, we have chapters on both sleep and technology and how to deal with it. And it has to do, again, with more mentoring, more consulting, more collaborating than setting limits. And limits are important, but you don't want to be turning off your internet at 10:30 at night for a high school senior and then send them up to college. We want kids to have experience, kind of figuring out, what do I need to do to stay well rested? How to manage my technology? And this, I'll end by saying that the last two chapters in our book, one's called Who's Ready for College, and the other is called Alternate Routes. And the idea is that I see so many kids, as I said earlier, who start college and they simply weren't ready. And it's pretty obvious. In retrospect, it was obvious they weren't ready. So part of the chapter is how do you tell if a kid's ready for college? And we make the point that college is a pretty brain toxic environment where you have chronic sleep deprivation, very inconsistent sleep schedules, a lot of drug use, a lot of competition, a lot of stress. And it's just not good for the brain. So you want kids to be really ready. And I just go through about some of these ways. I think about college as like a parallel universe. I tested this girl once who she was junior at Tulane, and she wanted to go to law school. So I was testing her to get a combination for law school. And she'd mentioned, she said, I think that the Ritalin I've been taking for my ADHD all these years is rotting my brain. And then she said, my mom thinks it's the alcohol. And I said, how much do you drink? She said, well, 4 to 5 drinks a night, 5 nights a week. I said, well, really, that's alcoholic level drinking. She said, my best friend drinks 12 drinks a night, 6 nights a week. And she thought, she'd already told me that she stayed up 2 nights in a row studying. She thought that the reason her brain wasn't working so well, it was the medicine she was taking for ADHD, probably the only thing that helped her. She didn't realize, living in college, that it was profoundly sleep deprivation and the chemical use. So we want kids to be really ready, running their own life before they go into a college environment. And the last thing is this, that so many kids grow up thinking that the road to success is extremely narrow. And if you ever fall off it, you're screwed. And it's just simply untrue. And kids I just was talking with students out in a very high achieving district in Ohio, who basically feel I'm my grades, and where you go to college is what makes you happy. That's the only way to get happy is going to the most elite college you can. And so it just turns out, well, it's not true. And I think that we want kids to know that there's an advantage to going to really late colleges, but it's not necessary. And so much of mental health is changing I have to I want to. And so my attitude and Ned's attitude, if kids want to go to Princeton, let them work at it and go. But don't tell them that somehow that's the only way they can be successful, because it's just not true. I tested one of my friend's kids, and we have stories in this chapter about in the alternate roots about people who became successful who without going to college, who flunked out several times and were good students, who created a really meaningful, positive life. Because we want kids to know there's so many ways to kind of make a way for yourself in this world. But also, I'll close with this. I was talking to one of my friends recently whose kids graduated from Yorktown High School in Arlington with a 1.67 grade point average. And he figured I got no college options. So he goes into the Navy, and he's really smart. And he kind of likes the autonomy he has in the Navy. He's learning all this new stuff. They really trust him. They entrust him a lot on a boat for a couple of years. Didn't want to be in the boat anymore. So he takes the SAT, gets the admiral to write him a recommendation. He's a fourth-year student at Harvard this year. And he graduated with a 1.67. When I tell underachieving students stories like this, it motivates them to work hard, because so many kids feel, if I'm not a top student, what's the point of trying? So the idea is we want to help kids develop this healthy sense of control of their own lives, in part by increasing their sense of autonomy or agency, giving them opportunities to develop that confidence they'll solve their own problems, and helping them have a balanced enough life to maintain a brain state where the prefrontal cortex stays online and regulates the rest of the brain. And so I'm going to close here and take any questions you might have.
All right, Dr. Stixrud, thank you so much. And we have quite a few questions coming up, so we will get started. The audience, if you do have questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat, and we will get to as many as we can. So the first one is around a question around for school age and adolescent teens. Is there a therapeutic approach that you would most recommend?
For what kind of problem? So, I mean,
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, it depends what the problem is. But I'll say this.
Yeah.
I do like I like cognitive behavioral therapy a lot for anxiety and depression. And I'm a huge fan of this relatively new SPACE program. It's an acronym for supportive parenting of anxious childhood emotions. It is developed by this wonderful guy at Yale. And the premise is that that we as parents, we don't cause kids to develop anxiety or OCD, but we can be part of the solution. So the SPACE program only works with parents. And the two main components are, you learn to say to your kid that I'm 100% confident. And I know this situation is I know standing at the bus stop is really scary for you by yourself, but I know you're 100% confident. I'm 100% confident you can handle your anxiety. And then also, because we're mammals, we adapt to kids' anxiety in ways that to try to protect them from being anxious, that actually allows them to avoid the things that make them anxious. And avoidance just makes you more anxious. So this SPACE program has been shown to be as effective in treating anxiety and depression as cognitive behavioral therapy is for kids itself. And so I'm a huge fan of CBT. And I'm a huge fan of this SPACE program. And I think that so often what we want to do as parents is change the energy. If you told the kids a million times, we kind of react instinctively. Try a different way. Joke about something you've been lecturing your kid about. apologize when you have to, and just change the energy is especially because anything that you argue about or fight about chronically is toxic. So those, I guess, those two things. And also, if I could do one thing, it'd be get kids to sleep more. And if we do a second thing, you get them to learn to meditate in school. You have some periods of the day where, at least if they wanted to, they could do it. So they have some way they can rely on to lower their stress response. In terms of therapy, I'd say CBT and the SPACE program.
Dr. Stixrud, thank you for actually mentioning Dr. Leibowitz from Yale. Our team just came back from a conference where Dr. Leibowitz was our keynote speaker. And so we're actually going to put the title of his book into the chat for families if they're interested. So thank you for mentioning him. It was quite an experience to listen to him talk about the SPACE program.
Yeah, it's brilliant. And part of the reason I'm so inclined to like it is that it takes this idea that you can't really, if you try to change somebody who's not asking you to help them change, all you get is conflict and resistance. It starts, Mary, as you know,
yes.
it's rooted in nonviolent resistance.
Right.
They studied Gandhi and Martin Luther King, who had this incredible impact, and they thought, how do we apply this to kids? And they worked with the most resistant kids and found if we be really clear, we don't try to change the kids, be really clear about what's right for us to do, and be firm. Decide, here's what I'm going to do, here's what I'm not going to do, and be firm in that. We stand our ground. That it has tremendous power. So yeah, great.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a next question with regard to around children who do have school refusal. How might a parent who has a child struggling with that be able to engage to kind of build autonomy? And we know that certainly attendance is a mandatory thing within schools. And so kind of working within that structure, how might we be better able to engage our kids who might have school refusal concerns?
Yeah. There's so much school refusal these days, and I think for many kids, I mean, schools are a huge source of anxiety and stress and pressure, as opposed to a place of growth. And I think we need to work on this so much. But I do think that having, if you have finding a therapist who specializes, and it's not easy, it's not easy to begin to see anybody, but finding a therapist who specializes, knows a lot about, has a lot of experience with school refusal, who can help figure out how to progressively get a kid back into school. And there's some kids, who hate school because it's not right for them. It's not it's a toxic environment. But a lot of kids, it's anxiety, and then the avoidance worsens the anxiety. And so I think that letting kids know, that one of the things I say with kids is, because I learned early on that if kids who felt badly about themselves, or kids who are really worried about something, if I tried to talk them out of it, they just hang on to it tighter. So what I got to saying is that I'm not going to try to take that away from them. Like I can't take that. I can't take fear away. But I want you to know that I'm 100% confident you can handle your fear. Like that. And actually, Dr. Leibowitz is doing a workshop in Virginia in October on the SPACE program in schools. That I think has a lot of implications for this, because we tend to make accommodations for kids in schools for anxiety in ways that, at least for some kids, may increase their anxiety. So what I would say is find a good therapist. And there are some cases, where this idea of a consultant that doesn't apply. For example, if a kid is showing a drug, if you find a kid's heavy drug user, deeply depressed, suicidal, kid has a bad eating disorder, you get treatment. You put them in treatment, whether they want to or not. And the idea is that there's some caveats. And if a school refusal, I mean, you couldn't make a kid go, but you can get a kid in a car and sit outside the school and just kind of look at the school for long enough that the kid's stress levels go down, and then kind of walk to the front. Nobody's going to make you go in. We're just going to go and we're going to walk up to the door, then we're going to come back to the car. And the idea, so you can decondition kids out of that anxiety progressively, but in part by helping them feel that they aren't being forced.
Okay. Thank you. So I will say that we get this question a lot here at the Family Resource Center around um, technology limits. We want kids to be able to use their technology, have some autonomy with their technology. But it's a challenge to help our kids find balance.
Yeah.
How would you address that?
Yeah. And we have chapters in both of our books about this.
Hmm.
But what I would certainly the first thing I want to say is that if you're the parent of little kids,
Hmm.
delay. I mean that there's a lot of really smart people now think that the one of the main reasons so many kids are anxious and unhappy is that they didn't play when they were little. That play has always been that kind of child-directed play has always been the way that human children and mammals, young mammals, they learn how to be adults. They learn how to master their emotions. They learn how to get along socially, how to solve problems through play. So it's child-directed play. And the concern is that there's so much because kids, now that they're 3 or 4, are starting on structured teams for sports, or they have electronics and they get used to playing games that are programmed and don't know how to play. And so the first thing I'd say is that both with technology for young children, they don't need it. They don't benefit from it.
Yep.
So let them play. As kids get older, and so I like the idea of wait till 8 to give kids
Hmm.
access to the internet. But so the idea is that when you let a kid start playing video games, let them know from the very beginning that I really want you to enjoy this. I want you to have as much fun with this as possible. But also, it's got to work for me in the sense that I want to feel like I'm being a good parent. And if I let you do this too much, that I'll feel like I'm blown as a parent, and that's not gonna work. So we'll find a way for you to use it that you feel good about and I feel good about. And if we agree on kind of some limits on it, and you violate the limits, what do you think we ought to do? I think it makes sense to take it away for like a day or two, and then you try again. Does that make sense to you? You kind of problem solve like that. But you set it up initially. And I think as kids get older, I think that there's a one by the name of Devorah Heitner, Heitner, who has written a couple books on kids' use of technology, and her angle is ideally we want to mentor rather than monitor, and the idea is what I find so often with kids and technology is and parents is that especially in video games, the parents don't have a clue what the kids are doing. And so all the energy is get off, fight, just stop. And what I say, and it's very hard to influence kids if all the energy they hear from us is no.
Hmm.
And so what we suggest is start with empathy. Start with trying to understand what they get out of it, so why they love it so much. What I suggest to parents with video games is learn how to play or watch them play and say stuff like, God, it makes me so happy to see. I can see why you love this so much. You're doing it with your friends, and you get that sense of confidence by beating the demon or getting to a new level. I see this is really cool. I can see why this is hard to stop. And then later, when things aren't stressful, we say, let's talk about this because I get it. I'm getting it now. But we got to work at this. We got to come to some agreement that works for me as well, because I don't want to feel like I'm the worst parent in the world. So my experience is that when we have conversations like that, we start with empathy and understanding, where kids know that we appreciate it. We're glad you're doing it. It's just that we got to find a way to limit it. That kids are often much more amenable when we take that approach. And as they get older, high school students, I think what we want to do is say, how can I help? Is there a way that there's some kids where there really are like about 10% of kids seem to be addicted to like games or technology, and they need treatment. And again, there's some kids where this mentoring or consulting idea, you put it on hold for a while. But most kids, the idea is that let me see if I can help. and you tell them about your own tech struggles with technology, and just acknowledging that these things are designed by psychologists to be as addictive as possible. And I have the same thing. I have the same problem, and it's a lot like that. But you don't want, again, the main thing is you don't want to be sending a kid off to college who hasn't struggled with it. And you want kids to know, I want you to learn how to do this, how to wrestle, because it's hard for all of us. So Devorah Heitner's new book is really good. I think I like the chapters in both our books about this idea about how you start by negotiating limits and working out limits that are agreed upon ahead of time, and showing empathy. And as they get older, really trying to mentor, kind of just use empathy, use your own experience, and then work out kind of limits that make sense. But you just don't want to be constantly monitoring, then expect a kid to go off to college and be able to handle it himself.
No, thank you. So a couple of people have asked about um, meditation, either apps or types of mindfulness opportunities, either for students, maybe younger to older students. What might you recommend? Because I know that was definitely something that quite a few parents have asked about.
Sure. So in our book, we talk about, in this radical downtime chapter of the self-driven child, we talk about meditation, and we talk about mindfulness and transcendental meditation, with both Ned and I practice, and they're very different, and in part because, I mean, mindfulness isn't one thing. There's a mindful meditation that where you
Right.
you kind of gently focus on the breath. But you have mindful walking, mindful eating, mindful drawing, and there's zillions of iterations of mindfulness. And my feeling is that mindfulness practices the way kids learn them can be very helpful in terms of they're like emergency medicine. When you're starting to get stressed, focus on your breath, that kind of thing. I think are very helpful. And just when you start to get upset, just kind of observe the feeling, and don't try to fight it. Just kind of observe it, and eventually it'll calm down. But I also think that the way transcendental meditation is practiced is really more like preventative medicine, where you do it twice a day, whether you feel like it or not, and over time it progressively calms down that stress response, kind of normalizes the stress response, makes that amygdala less reactive, and strengthens the ability of the prefrontal cortex to regulate the amygdala and the rest of the stress circuits in the brain. And so my feeling is that ideally, kids use meditation as just something that you just do, kind of to again, to throw off more stress than you're carrying on, than you bring on. So for younger children, I don't know if there's certain mindfulness practices that I know kids do in school that some seem to like, some seem to hate, and I don't have a great feel for that. I've done a couple of studies of transcendental meditation in independent schools, kids with ADHD, where it got just dramatic results. When kids did twice a day, but it's hard to do that in public schools. But I think that if what I suggest to parents, if they're interested in meditation, is develop a practice yourself, and suggest that your kid learn. If you like it, have your kid learn and let them know, I'm not going to try to make you do this, but I just want you to know that this tool is available. In the same way, a lot of kids go to college who think that once I get into a great college, I'll be happy. And they realize that's all there is, that didn't do it. And then they learn about the science of happiness. They say, why didn't people tell me? And I feel the same way that we know that there's things like meditation that can be so helpful to young people. And they don't, why don't we tell them? So my feeling, I'm a huge fan of transcendental meditation, which is unlikely to get into the public schools anytime soon. But I do think that kids will practice them outside of school. I know kids who do, especially if they do it with their families. So for little kids, I think that the main thing right now is probably mindfulness practices. I think for adolescents, I think TM is easier to do. I think some kind of combination of that daily kind of settling the mind down and these active techniques for being the mindfulness techniques for managing things in the moment.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. So another parent is asking around their child seems to get really frustrated around making mistakes. And that makes that child resistant to trying new things. How, how might a parent work through that with their child?
Yeah. Um, I'll just mention that we have there's a chapter in our second book. It's called Communicating Healthy versus Toxic Expectations. And the idea is that it turns out that parental expectations and teacher expectations are really powerful in terms of really powerful predictors of kids' achievement. But they're powerful when they're communicated not as I expect you to or you must perform at this level, but I have confidence that you can. Because you must, I expect you, this is what you need to do, I expect you to do this. That's unconditional love. That's unconditional approval of kids. It just makes kids not trust us, not feel close to us. And so, what was the question? I just lost my train of thought. Maybe what was the question?
No, just around sorry, let me scroll back up.
Yeah.
But no, just certainly around making sure that um, oh my, you know what? I lost it myself. So
I'm sorry.
here, no, we are fine. Let me get back to it. Oh, so making mistakes.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
So I mean, I think that that one of the things we can do as parents is certainly is let kids know. I mean, ideally, you let the kids. I love you no matter how you achieve, no matter how hard you work, no matter what you do. And I think that there's a difference between it turns out there's a pretty big difference between the healthy pursuit of excellence and perfectionism. Where the kids are really motivated to do a good job. If they make a mistake, they say, oh, let me look at that. I want to learn from that. Kids who have more perfectionistic tendencies or fear of mistakes, basically they try to hide mistakes. They try to avoid things that are hard, so they don't make mistakes and look stupid. And so I will say that there's Bonnie Zucker, who's a brilliant psychologist here in Maryland, has a book that's for perfectionists, including perfectionistic young people. And also, there's a really nice chapter in a new book that's coming out next week by Robin Silverman, and it's called How to Talk with Kids About Anything. And there's a really nice chapter on talking with kids about mistakes and failure. And part of it is simply you can't with kids who are afraid of making mistakes. Again, you can't talk them out of it. You can't. What we can do is we can say what I say to kids is that I know that making mistakes makes you really feel anxious. It makes you feel worried about yourself, and maybe it makes you feel ashamed. And I can't take that away from you, but I want you to know that from my point of view, making mistakes is the only way you get better at stuff. It's the only way you really develop. You try something, it didn't work that well, so you try a different way. Or and I think I'm pretty confident that you can figure this out, that you can start to take some chances and see. What I recommend to teachers of kids who are afraid to make mistakes is say, I won't accept an assignment unless it has 3 mistakes in it. And I'll give you extra credit if you make the mistake and then correct it like that. And I think that really works pretty well. Where you kind of because what you want to do is you want to change the meaning of making a mistake. And at the highest in colleges now, they're having kind of the wall of rejection, where kids put up all their college rejection letters that they got. And the idea is that to try to normalize making mistakes. But these two resources I think are excellent resources on perfectionism. And again, what I tell kids is I don't want you to be a slacker. I want you to work hard. I love that you want to perform at a high level, but I want you to think about transforming from perfectionistic to a healthy achiever.
Yeah, no, great. Thank you. No, I think I remember when I was in the classroom and, um, the goal was always to make sure that my students were understanding the concepts, right? And
Right.
and so giving them opportunities to redo, right? And make sure that they, can go back and change their answers and that they're learning and that there's kind of a whole sequence of it's not just the test and it stops there, right?
Yeah.
So thank you. Yeah.
No, that's great. That's great.
All right. So, another family member is asking, their particular child just struggles with even just daily kind of tasks, brushing teeth or just simplest things. And they get into kind of this anxiety spiral and then they just avoid everything so that they completely shut down. How might we have a conversation with our child? Um, Around, when those situations happen, how do we help them bridge those feelings and emotions?
Yeah. I think that in our second book, What Do You Say? The first
Mhm.
chapter is about connection, developing a strong connection with your kid. And two of the most important tools are empathy and validation. So ideally with kids, you always start with empathy. You always start with,
Right.
I think I understand. And the way you feel about it, there's a zillion kids who don't like to brush their teeth. I mean, I get that. It's not, you are the only kid in the world. And then also what happens with a lot of kids is there's a nightly fight over these routines. It just becomes so stressful for everybody and it interferes with their sleep. And so the first thing for me is to make sure that we aren't fighting, it doesn't become a fight. And so I think that is if mom is the one who's fighting the kid about getting to brush their teeth or do the routines, then ask the kid, would you rather your dad or your sister, your older brother helps you with this? What or you engage in this collaborative problem solving where you say, when the kid's not upset and you aren't upset, you say, let's talk about brushing your teeth because you know I know you don't want to get cavities. You don't love the dentist, and I know that you're smart enough to kind of to know that. But and also that for me, I don't want to fight with you all the time about it. So what's the best way? What's the best way for us to try to get your, even if you don't do it every night, we get you to brush your teeth more. And the idea is you're starting to move in that direction by lowering the temperature, moving that direction, starting with empathy, and just deciding that you tell your kid, I just love you too much to fight with you about this.
Yeah.
I care about your teeth, and I don't want you to have cavities, but you're the most precious thing in the universe to me, and so I don't want to fight about it. So you move to this kind of problem solving about.
Yeah, no, thank you. Well, Dr. Stixrud, we have come to the end of our time together this morning, and I want to thank you so very much for sharing all of this with us. And I want to thank our audience today. Thank you so much. And please do reach out to the Family Resource Center if you're looking for resources. We do have both of Dr. Stixrud's books in our library. And again, thank you, everyone, and hope everyone has an absolutely wonderful, wonderful weekend.
Yeah.
Take care,
Yeah.
everyone.
Thanks, Mary.